We're standing at the base of the Washington Monument in the middle of Washington, D.C. This is one of the great icons of the United States.
And the monument is on a bit of a hill, and if we look in one direction, we see the Capitol building, and in the other direction, a monument to another president. We see the Lincoln Memorial in front of a beautiful reflecting pool.
And then perpendicular is the White House, this celebration of the great founding father of the United States, George Washington, at the intersection of the legislature and of the White House. That is the power of the presidency and the power of the Congress.
This is a city that is planned to speak to the ideals of the Republic of the United States. And so the Washington Monument was planned even while Washington himself was alive and took almost 100 years after his death to be completed.
The first monument that was envisioned was one that celebrated Washington on horseback, an equestrian sculpture. And this is a tradition that had been used to represent kings, but it actually went all the way back to ancient Rome, to the celebration of ancient Roman emperors. But while that tradition has been represented in sculptures in New York, in Richmond, Virginia, and in Baltimore, we're standing before something that is of an entirely different scale.
It's a little odd when we think about it in the context of D.C., where we have these memorials to Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln that are more of what I expect of a way of remembering a great hero of the United States. We see their likeness. We see it in the context of an ancient classical temple, which reminds us of the ancient Roman Republic.
We don't see anything else in Washington, D.C. that looks just like this. This is so singular.
And maybe that's because we think about Washington as singular, as the first president, as a man who was very much idealized.
So what do we make of the abstraction of this form? Well, I think what's critical to understand is that this is in fact drawn from antiquity. But it's not the antiquity of ancient Greece. It's not the antiquity of ancient Rome. This is drawn from ancient Egyptian structures.
These were often set up as pairs in front of Egyptian temples, and we refer to them as obelisks. Obelisks have a long history, not just in ancient Egypt, but they were actually moved by Roman emperors from Egypt to Rome because they were seen as symbols of power and authority. And if we think about the obelisk as a symbol of imperial authority in ancient Rome, it's a far cry from the ideals of George Washington and from the ideals of a young republic. Notions of self-governance, of power being in the hands of the people and not an autocrat.
Which is actually why it took so long to decide what to build here. It was clear that the country wanted to honor George Washington. The big problem was, what would that memorial look like?
And so this first idea of an equestrian sculpture, that idea didn't go very far. And then when Washington dies, there was a unanimous resolution for a public tomb right in this location, even though Washington himself specified that he wanted to be buried in his home in Mount Vernon.
That outdoor tomb was intended to take an ancient Egyptian form as a stepped pyramid. The real problem was that there were two divergent political theories in the United States in these early years. There were, on the one hand, the Republicans, who thought power should be vested in the people, that government should be minimized as much as possible, and that we should be a largely self-governing populace. On the other side of the aisle were the Federalists, who believed that there should be a strong central government, that national infrastructure, taxes, and other levers of governance would be important to the new republic. And it's so interesting that this basic division informed the arguments for and against a grand monument to George Washington.
There was actually a vote along party lines about the proposed monument in the form of the stepped pyramid, with the Federalists voting for it and the Republicans voting against it, feeling that it was too ostentatious, that it was essentially a monument that would demonstrate the worship of a man who was singular and extraordinary instead of being one of the people, of the citizenry.
And so the memory of George Washington, this man that both sides agreed was the ideal symbol of the new nation, became this central point of political contention. But despite these differences, some practical progress was made.
In 1833, the Washington National Monument Society, a private organization, was founded to support the building of the monument. And at that point, the idea for the design had evolved into a temple crowned by an obelisk.
It's such an architectural mishmash because on the one hand, the temple is in the ancient Greek and Roman style, but the obelisk is Egyptian. And it's such a perfect example of the ways in which the 19th century looted history for precedents that spoke to grandeur, but also for them, I think, a kind of historical authenticity. Some progress was started with the building of the obelisk itself, although fundraising was slow and then finally ground to a halt when a group called the Know-Nothings seized control of this private society that was meant to fund and build the obelisk. Now, the Know-Nothings were an extreme political group that wanted to keep immigrants out of the United States.
And there was lots of criticism at the time of the design itself. Someone referred to it as a broomstick and a handle. And so there was really no agreement yet, even though it had been begun, about what the final version would really be like.
Needless to say, nothing was done during the Civil War. And I think for many, the unfinished stub of a building became a symbol of the failure of the United States.
So in 1876, Congress resolves to finish the monument. So this becomes, once again, a publicly funded project. Congress asks for designs, and all sorts of things were offered, including memorials in the style of the medieval Gothic, of the Italian Renaissance, designs that were a mishmash of different historical styles.
As we enter the last quarter of the 19th century, the real hero of the story is Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Casey of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He takes over the project, but he is very careful to say that he's not creating an architectural design. He is simply an engineer moving the project forward.
Perhaps in the end, what the monument speaks to is a country that was aggressively expanding westward, increasingly wealthy, technologically sophisticated.
Some historians have said that it was only possible for Congress to act in 1876 in the wake of the Civil War because the age of George Washington had receded enough, that the old arguments between the Federalists and the Republicans had been replaced by new realities.
What was the language one could use in the modern world to speak to these transcendent values?